Well, Nuon is clearly core infrastructure, and we see a lot of core infrastructure products being open source, which is this next step that you're taking to build trust. Can you talk about the decision to open source and also the timing? Like, why open source now?
I think part of it is the last, I would say 2 years has been this big boom of companies thinking about bring your own cloud and asking for bring your own cloud. There just needs to be open source infrastructure for this thing to exist. But then I also think about it from a different perspective. This sort of BYOC decision is so critical that like the first thing that comes up in every single conversation is like, if I'm using Nuon to deploy into my customer environment, does that basically bring this sort of like third party into every single customer deal? The first thing they're thinking of is like this risk, right? Even if we run Nuon in their account, it's almost like Nuon is the sort of foundation of trust actually, because it's the thing that's being used to manage the environment for the customer and vendor that relationship.
Welcome to the Open Source Startup Podcast. This is Tim from SNVC and Robby from Modern Technical Fund. We're so stoked to have Jon, the CEO of Nuon, building infra for bring your own cloud deployments. So welcome, Jon.
Thanks for having me.
We're so excited to have you on because there's a really big announcement that's part of this podcast. You are actually going open source as we speak, as this podcast comes out. But I think before we get into all that, why don't we talk a bit about what Nuon is, where the company started. I think it's about 4 years old. So why don't you give us some history on the company and where the initial idea came from?
Yeah, totally. We're 4 years in, I guess, or hopefully maybe we're the first company to ever announce with you all on the podcast that we're moving to open source. But yeah, so I mean, quick background for me, like spent the last 10 plus years building like software for deploying and managing applications. It's just been my kind of jam my entire career. I think it was really like late 2021. I had a different product I was working on, had a customer kind of share this idea of like, hey, can I like take this product and deploy it in my customer's environment? And like at the time, like there wasn't a term called bring your own cloud or anything like that. And like, you know, it's been a really long journey and a really fun journey along the way. But I would say really in like the last 2 years, we've seen this sort of like industry movement towards bring your own cloud and this idea of like, hey, for modern like database products and like infrastructure, like even like application layer products, customers are actually demanding that the systems are deployed in their environment, integrated inside their networks. Like you think about like any AI product, LLMs are essentially becoming the default way to like interact with like customer data. They're moving into customer environments. Like there's so much sort of momentum. And at the same time, like, you know, this is a hard problem. Everybody who talks about offering BYOC says it's hard. We took this sort of journey of like building infrastructure to make that easier. And we've learned that's also really hard. But yeah, so we're now kind of seeing the market come around and it's really exciting.
So I think most people should know the idea, what a cloud is and what bring your own cloud is. Right? Like you just mentioned, is install your product in your customer's cloud, not your own cloud. I think nobody probably seen what infra product in this space even is. A lot of people might have some ideas, but very vague, right? So can you talk about like, what does even a product even looks like? What would a product solve for folks, right? And what are the things that your users without you have to do, and maybe after you don't have to do anymore? Can you give us some comparisons?
Yeah, totally. So just going back to like what even BYOC is, right? If you think about it, like with like multi-tenant cloud, you know, you're using a product, you go to their website, you sign up. The vendor owns all the data. For the vendor who's building the developer, like building this product, they push their own environment, they're updating, like they're in charge. In self-hosted or on-prem, you buy the software or you find it on GitHub or wherever, and you're basically like setting up servers and, you know, configuring your Kubernetes cluster and like deploying it in like either your own environment or your own AWS account. BYOC is a sort of middle ground, right? It's a little bit like self-hosted and on-prem. It's a little bit kind of like SaaS. And the idea is like, it's actually like a SaaS inside your customer account. Like you as the person consuming the software, you give the credentials to your AWS account or connect it to your AWS account and it gets updated, pushed in, and you kind of like forget about it, right? You just get to use the software. So when you think about that, like you're building this for yourself, like what are the things that you're going to do? You pretty much have to like think through like, and it's a lot closer to like the sort of multi-tenant cloud world than the self-hosted world, where you're thinking through like, okay, what do we do when we like push to prod? Well, you know, we're landing, you know, PRs, checks, we're doing some sort of promotion, we're updating containers, we're then pushing updates to our infrastructure, maybe we're adding like a new database, and then all of a sudden we're going to go ahead and deploy to production, we're going to monitor it, And then from there, make sure the thing works. You kind of have to solve all those problems, but in your customer's environment to offer BYOC. And sure, there's like a ton of automation and things you can do to do that. But what we found is like, actually the hard part is like, how do you kind of like make this whole SaaS experience, make your product work, but not need like direct access to this customer environment? And how do you sort of protect the customer environment? I think that's really like the hard part. It's not just like, hey, package your thing and like throw it in somebody's account. It's okay, cool. That's the easy part, right? It's like, hey, like take your software, continuously update it as you're evolving your architecture and your infrastructure. Like you add a message queue, cool. You're adding like a vector store, cool. Like how do you kind of keep this thing working? And then how do you sort of have that trust inside the customer environment so that they're not worried about what your system's doing? Because if you think about it from like the customer's perspective, the whole reason they want you in their account is to integrate with their data, like be inside their network. It's security, it's a bunch of things, right? Data sovereignty. But at the same time, like they know their environment really well, your application really well. There kind of has to be a little bit of connection of the both for for it to be secure, reliable, robust. And done poorly, like it's actually way more risky than multi-tenant SaaS, right? And part of the value of multi-tenant SaaS historically is that the vendor has control over both and they can really integrate both. And so, we see a lot of these challenges, like just how do you do what you're doing in multi-tenant cloud and bring it into a customer environment without all the security risk?
Well, Nuon is clearly core infrastructure, and we see a lot of core infrastructure products being open source, which is this next step that you're taking to build trust, especially for an earlier stage company. Can you talk about the decision to open source and also the timing? Like why open source now?
Yeah, totally. Well, I think part of it is the last, I would say 2 years has been this big boom of companies thinking about bring your own cloud and asking for bring your own cloud. So definitely we see like a market opportunity where like there just needs to be open source infrastructure for this thing to exist and for the space. And so I think that's been a big motivating factor as we made this decision. But then I also think about it from a different perspective, which is, really like as we think about it, we've operated out of a closed source model. You go sign up on Nuon's website, or we deploy Nuon into your environment for you. Can talk about the whole like building Nuon with Nuon cycle that we do. But one of the things that we found was no matter really like what we were doing or even really like related to our products, this sort of BYOC decision is so critical that like the first thing that comes up in every single conversation is like, hey, if I'm using Nuon to deploy into my customer environment, like, does that basically bring this sort of like third party into every single customer deal? And historically, we've seen a bunch of startups who will like, earlier stage companies who will sign up and use Nuon and like they don't think about those things yet or have that problem yet, but they're also not yet at a point of like scaling this to dozens or hundreds of their enterprise customers. And then the larger software vendors who are like building this in-house or thinking of building it in-house, the first thing they're thinking of is like this risk, right? And for them, the cost of doing this and building sort of things internally is actually lower than the risk of, a closed source product in some ways. And so, as we started to just kind of ask these questions, we're talking to customers who are really exciting and want to use the product and are thinking about BYOC. But ultimately, like there's this risk factor. And even if we run Nuon in their account, it's almost like Nuon is the sort of foundation of trust, actually, because it's the thing that's being used to manage the environment for the customer and vendor, that relationship. And as we were thinking, like we actually want to be, and where we see the value is Nuon can be this connective tissue between the customer environment and the vendor. And really the only way to do that and deliver on that mission and enable BYOC for everybody is to make it open source and actually make it like true open source where, not only can you like run this thing in production, but iterate on it, but also our hope is that like we can take this and make the packaging layer, the approach of how like the Nuon runner works and like our architecture model and make those like standards over time.
So I think it will be good to talk about what do you plan to open source, like what specifics are being open source. And for users, obviously, they know your company, you're open sourcing some things. What things are not open source? And how do I think about that sort of like the separation here?
So the way that we're thinking about it and like I think a core kind of guiding principle here is that you should be able to run Nuon in production completely from our open source model. And you should be able to unlock and power your first number of customers in production without ever having to like talk to Nuon, right? And really like the value comes and where we believe that we provide the most value is when you have 10, 20, 100 enterprise customers you're powering with a platform. And so the way that we're thinking about it is like pretty much to start the entire product. I think over time, we're going to focus on some enterprise tooling for, vendors who have more and more customers and they need things like release windows and like, managing like different customer customizations. But, we believe that for this to work, you have to be able to run the thing in production. And so that means making it easy to run locally. It means making it easy, like having a production self-hosting guide, right? Which is, you don't see everywhere actually anymore. Like for our current customers, nothing's changing. When we turn the repo over, you're going to see like nuon.co sign up at the top. You're going to have self-hosting directions. For most of our larger customers today, we actually deploy Nuon into their account using Nuon, and we don't expect that to change for the most part. I think what will change is we have found that some of the larger vendors, especially for like infrastructure companies, they're actually looking at this as like core infra that they can sort of evolve and build into their sort of like core chain of trust. I haven't talked about how our platform works very much, and like that's kind of part of this. As a quick segue, like we basically have a control plane, and that control plane is used to power what are called like Nuon installs. And each Nuon install, think of it as like, hey, your application in a customer's environment. And each of those installs is managed by a remote runner, which is essentially an agent that gets deployed in the customer environment that is managing everything from permissions to pushing updates to the cluster, pushing apt updates, like running monitoring and observability scripts and like all that. And so what we really found was like that thing that goes in the customer environment is the only way that this sort of like BYOC model works. But at the same time, like that's the most critical thing that the customer wants to be able to like look at it, understand like what is it doing. We thought about just open sourcing the Nuon runner to start, like just the piece of code that goes in the customer environment. But then as we started to like really think about like what does the industry need, we were like, well, that's not useful in and of itself, right? And that doesn't really prove anything or give anybody that sort of like peace of mind. And we just kept asking the question of like, hey, like what actually solves the core problem of like, you want to run software in your customer's environment. We want this model to be the default way for every infra and like B2B software company out there. And how do we deliver on that? And I think that really like being able to just go from zero to production is like so critical.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too, because a lot of open source companies, I'd say there's a ton of different flavors of open source companies now, but a lot of them will start with an open source project and then the company comes and they figure out the monetization layer on top of that. Or if they open source later, it's like open periphery where it's kind of like your approach where it's just the runners, like it's not the entire kind of code base. How are you thinking about, and we should do maybe a year or two from now, like learnings on how it went. But at this point, how are you thinking about how the company will change from are you going to do a lot more kind of community focused stuff? Like, how is it really going to change from like a day-to-day perspective or team perspective?
Yeah. So I can tell you the first thing that we're already seeing changes with, and I think as a closed source company, and this is something that I think is like kind of a founder learning in the infrastructure space. Things are so much harder when you're closed source in certain ways because every conversation is inevitably transactional. So when I think about like, if I'm going and talking to like even founder-led sales to like a later stage company, the way of sort of like giving value or providing value and like building any type of partnership almost always feels like it's like this pressure of like buying your product or not. And I don't think a lot of founders like talk about that enough. And I've already seen like there's so much goodwill with like open source companies, especially in the infrastructure space, where like just kind of talking about this, like we've already had like 5 different people who were like, hey, can I contribute to this one thing or do this thing? And like, there's this sort of like new sort of operational mode where like you could just like start partnering with different companies and doing like things together. And it's like, hey, like we're open source, like go contribute this or that. And like, that's something that's changed already. And it's honestly made our sales cycles a lot different and easier. And like, but also just made it easier to like build cool partnerships with other companies that we admire and like, want to do things with. And that's really important. I think internally, like what we think will like outside of like the product and all that, like, and like, powering more and more customers, what we think will actually change for us is like, there's going to be a lot more community focus. We currently have like a BYOC community, which is really like customers who are using us. we imagine that, support for different providers or different clouds or different architectures, like that'll be kind of a primary way that people will want to contribute. If you think about like the shape of a Nuon, right? Like, or any infrastructure, you kind of have to, for this kind of space, you have to be able to connect to different providers, right? Like we have people who are doing like control plane, data plane apps, or like bringing in like their infrastructure as code or containers. And there's all this sort of like integration layer, which we think is kind of interesting. And like people will definitely want to contribute to, especially if there's something about their stack that they feel is like unique, which that's another topic altogether as well about open source is, but yeah, we can kind of dig into that. But, I think the other side that kind of changes is like the way you interact with your customers and the way you communicate with your customers. Right now, we operate out of a bunch of Slack channels, and we're, dealing with like customer feedback or building something. And then, we're sharing like preview builds, or we're, putting out our change log. But when the software is open source, you're actually collaborating with your customer in a different way, where it's like they're seeing a pull request be open, and like they see a new feature, and like they're able to give you feedback. And we've actually had a few folks that are using us today that we've shared our plans with, and they're really excited about that because they're like, we want to be able to contribute to it, and we want to be able to make changes. And yes, this is still valuable and we want to pay you, but at the same time, like we also want more ownership. And so I don't know. And I'm sure you see this with other companies, and like, I'm looking at it from like the sort of glass half full. We haven't talked about the hard parts that we expect yet, but it does create this sort of like shared ownership with your customers, which I think is so important for infrastructure products. And it's something that like we've found even as a closed source company is really important, right? There's this shared ownership and commitment with your customers. But when it's open source, that just goes to a whole new level when they're looking at code, seeing PRs and all that. I think naturally we'll be working out of our GitHub repo a lot more, sharing sort of like change logs from there versus like our doc site and like all the sort of tactical stuff, as well as also investing in like community, opening up like a whole new sort of type of profile of marketers that we can kind of bring in, or sort of like, even just like community folks who are like in the repo, working in the repo and kind of helping like manage, as things come in.
We've talked about the benefits of open sourcing and why it makes sense for Nuon. What was, when you were making this decision, what was the flip side where you were like, okay, here are some of the reasons we're worried, or, some of the hard parts about open source at this stage?
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest worries is like, you're thinking about making this big change, and this is as big of a change as you can kind of like think about at this scale, right? It's not a pivot. It's like the product's exactly the same and all this, but like we're changing this model to help with some specific problems, and like, really also to give back to the community. Like we see so much goodwill about BYOC out there and so many customers asking about it, but also there's like so much mystery. And I think what the biggest fear is like, well, like what if, you open source and it doesn't actually solve the sort of problems around like trust, or it doesn't solve the problems around like creating a standard for BYOC, or help some of those larger companies like want to adopt you, or even earlier companies want to adopt you, right? And I think one of the bigger risks there is like nothing changes. But at the same time, like, and again, like even today, like we have, startups joining and like using the platform, and like we're talking to amazing customers, and we have amazing customers running us in production. But I think there's also this like, and I think this is part of like building an infrastructure product. There is a DIY focus where learning an infrastructure product, especially a closed source one, is an investment from a team. And, in a lot of ways, like it can also feel like a risk, right? And I think that's one of the things that, we're really trying to solve for. And the risk is like, for us, if we move to open source, that doesn't change at all, right? But I think the reality there is like, well, when we were open source, if folks are even seeing the platform and able to understand all the things that it does without the sort of pressure of like, let me run and play with this thing, they're actually able to see like what type of investment they're making by bringing it in-house, or even just learn from us. And there's so many other ways to collaborate versus using the product or not. There's ways on like thinking through like the packaging, or like the way that the runner works. And our worst case scenario is that, people don't use Nuon and run it in production and self-host it. They just use it to sort of like, hey, here's how I would do things, or how I would not do things. Totally fine. But I think there's so many other ways to collaborate, and for us to sort of gather information about how people are doing it in the community. And I think, the nature of the types of folks that we're selling to are some of the most sort of hardcore folks in terms of like building and operating and managing things in production, right? Like if you think about the persona of somebody who's helping build a BYOC offering at like an infrastructure company or a database provider company, like those folks have carried pagers for 10 years. Like the last thing they ever want to deal with is like getting paged or having a customer issue that they can't fix. And so we think even if nothing changes from like a go-to-market perspective or we can't kind of position it as a standard, there's still that sort of valuable feedback cycle that we can get, which will help us improve the product over time.
So on your webpage, I think what's interesting is not just mentioning about like engineers trying to build product and deploying to their customers. You also have an F2000 page about why being recipients of this, right? Like I'm buying vendors to install in my cloud. You even have marketing towards them. And so that's probably not common. Can you talk about like what is a value prop for maybe like large corporations, looking into vendors, and what is the sort of thing you're trying to unlock here by talking to those folks and marketing them?
Yeah, I have this dream that bring your own cloud is like the default way for all infrastructure companies and software companies to distribute software, right? And like it seems so clear, right? Like multi-tenant SaaS is such a bad idea for certain products, and like it's a great idea for others, right? Like it's not binary, but there's a specific set of products that just like make so much sense when it's in the customer environment. And so I was thinking about it and I was like, well, where does the demand for this come from? And it's the enterprise, right? It's like the Fortune 2000. And that's where it starts today, right? If you talk to the average startup that's thinking about BYOC, it's the story we hear many, many hundred times, like, hey, I have this one customer who's like wants this in their account or whatever. And, actually this is a recent thing. So over the past 4 years, we haven't really spent a lot of time talking to the end customers. We've always felt like, hey, like trying to go navigate into like a top 10 bank is really hard and is going to be really hard to even open up those conversations and like, who do you sell to? But we tried it actually. And we actually found that there is, and again, I go back to this like goodwill thing, but those large enterprises have so much goodwill for what we're doing. And they're so willing to make like connections and introductions. And it's kind of been this sort of like almost a flywheel starting where we like make connections where we're trying to like just talk to these folks. And they're like, hey, I want to run this software in my account. Like, can you help with it? And we've started to see this like emerging sort of like landing zone pattern where essentially there's kind of demand to run Nuon in the enterprise's account so that any sort of vendor managed application could be sort of managed by a central sort of like Nuon in the enterprise. And the idea there is like, hey, if you're a software vendor selling into like a top 10 bank, you could package your app with Nuon, share your Nuon config to anybody who is running Nuon in their own environment, run Nuon sync, and then create your installs and deploy. And so if you think about like, a top 10 bank or something like that, like they have hundreds of instances of like their database or their temporal or their durable execution, and like having a sort of central control plane for that is valuable, even if they're self-hosting something or if they're consuming like a BYOC software. And we see this like, again, there's this connective tissue between customer and vendor. We've hyper-focused on the vendor for 3.5, 4 years. And we've built tools to make vendors' lives really easy and to be able to, quickly offer BYOC. And now we've started to say, hey, like all the things that the vendor wants, the customer actually wants too. And how do you sort of orchestrate and like facilitate those conversations essentially? And what I mean, like the way that the software is updated and communicated, and like, you're a vendor who's pushing a new version of your app and you need to add a database, right? Like how does that whole thing happen, right? Like how does the customer know to like press yes, I want this update, and like what they need to do from a permission standpoint or whatever it is. And it's kind of been interesting actually. It's like there's a lot of goodwill, and to be frank, that's also helped lead into this open source decision, right? Like there was really like the larger vendors that we see, and even like startups who have these kind of challenges, and they're like, this is such an important tool for us. We want to have as much control as possible. But then on the other side, we're like, as we talk to these enterprises, we were like, well, there's also like a whole motion of like, hey, somebody can't even try a cloud product. and being able to like fork a repo or pull a repo locally, run a command and play with something is not only a good way to sort of like help the discovery piece, but also being open source allows that like, hey, we can trust this thing. And if we trust this thing and you use this thing, then all of a sudden, like we can actually consume more software. We can actually take risk with or bets with, new vendors that we wouldn't have used otherwise that only have a multi-tenant version of their product or something like that.
It's really interesting because I don't think of many infrastructure companies this way, but you're almost like you enable sales because you enable companies to sell to big enterprise that maybe otherwise wouldn't. Can you talk a bit about AI and how that, I imagine in some ways from like a data sovereignty security perspective, will be a good tailwind for you? But yeah, can you talk a bit more about that?
You're totally right. Like we're seeing so much demand from like AI companies. And, we also see like the enterprises want to adopt AI and feel behind, right? Like there's this sort of fear and, AI is moving so fast that if you have any sort of red tape between you and trying a product, you're losing right now, right? Like you're falling behind. I think there's interesting things. So I actually like, and I mean, over conversations with Tim actually about like architectures and like Nuon enabling different architectures, like we see all these sorts of like AI first architectures now that are happening. And, it starts with like, I put a post out a few weeks ago about like blob storage and like why it's like a big thing for BYOC. That's just one example of like a BYOC architecture. For like AI, we're seeing this like bring your own key, bring your own LLM, or like control plane, data plane split type of architectures where just new types of products can kind of be built when they're partially run inside a customer's environment. You also see things like all the cloud providers are kind of starting to build these sort of like bindings for the models. And so you can suddenly do integrations with models inside the customer's account. And then there's the spend piece where like maybe your customer has access to GPUs because they have $100 million contract with AWS and like, so there's like a margins piece of it. I think the security and data sovereignty thing is really big as well. And there's this idea of like the customer, and I'll honestly just say like VPC, AWS VPC seems like in the wild, like far and away, like the destination to get your software. It's not just getting into a customer's AWS account. Like VPC has so much tooling to connect with different things that if you can somehow run inside of a customer's existing network, you can talk to so much more data so much sooner. And then you start to see like basically private endpoints to talk to their LLMs and talk to their data. I mean, RAG isn't really as popular as it was, but like that same kind of concept of like, hey, you have like AI products that can talk to things inside their network, like that's huge. And so there's so many factors there. And then you start to see like there's more momentum around with the cloud providers building some tooling here. I think about like Azure's like OpenAI bindings, for instance. Then it's like suddenly you can actually like, you don't have to run the whole model in the customer account. Like maybe they already have a model running or they have access to one or they picked one, but you just bring your app in and, then all of a sudden it's like, hey, like the enterprise is more willing to try your product earlier and also like pilot you with more data. And that's something I actually talk to folks about. Like if you're a startup and you're doing a pilot, like it is in your best interest to not say, hey, I'm going to do BYOC once the customer signs. You actually want to do BYOC upfront because then you can do the pilot with all their data and you can actually like give that peace of mind and actually run way better pilots. And I think this is sort of this like trap that I see a lot of, and I think it's part of where the industry is. It's part of not having open source BYOC infra. It's part of like, not having enough tooling, but most people are very reactive to offering bring your own cloud. And if they were proactive, they actually would be able to run much better pilots with larger enterprises that do want to move faster. And really like that's part of, going back to even why we have like the thing on our website about the Fortune 2000, like our hope and vision is like an open source standard will emerge, hopefully Nuon, that is like, hey, here's a control plane for consuming software in an enterprise's account. And the cost of you being a 5-person AI startup who wants to unlock a Fortune customer is like, hey, go build a Nuon config. It takes you a day and a half to like connect your app or whatever it takes. And all of a sudden, like that's all you have to do to run that pilot. You don't need to do anything else. And then all of a sudden those pilots get to touch like a real production LLM potentially, or talk to like, even if it's fake data inside their environment, right? Like, and sort of build these much better sort of experiences up front and hopefully move faster.
Actually, that's a very thing maybe we should dig deeper because, I've been an engineer, right? I had to work on BYOC my whole life to some degree. And a lot of engineers, especially when you're a developer, BYOC is kind of like one of those things where like you underestimate how much work it really requires. And sometimes when you went through experience, like you will necessarily know the complexity, but even the next time around, when there is a vendor coming in to sell you BYOC, I'm still not entirely sure what the trade-offs are, right? And maybe since you're open sourcing your product and you're making it so much more easier, what is your typical advice for folks? Because obviously it seems like as early as possible, but what is like a perfect timing to really start to think about packaging your product in almost like a BIOC ready way, right? And what's the trade-offs here? Is it make it harder to deploy or harder to manage? Because now I still had to think about my own cloud and BIOC. Should I always do it when I really have a BIOC customer pretty much ready to go? And how long will it take? A lot of the kind of harder things to kind of think about, right? So what is your typical way to get engineers feel comfortable adopting you a bit earlier than not?
It's actually interesting. I would say in the last 6 months, I've seen a lot more companies actually being open to like starting from like day zero or thinking like even pre-first customer of being BYOC. And I think the argument is that by doing that, they will be able to essentially like have an easier path as they evolve their application. So you're thinking about like PlanetScale is a good example. I've talked to Sam about this before. And, the PlanetScale folks made a decision essentially from day one to offer like, I don't think it was called BYOC or even called BYOC today, actually, but like to run a SaaS in their customer's account. And all the decisions that sort of add up as they're iterating on, customers and product, like lead to that way. And we see a lot of companies starting to do that. I think of like, WarpStream or TurboPuffer, they're using like S3 and they're like designing around S3 because S3 is like a way to store like the data in the customer environment. Like every customer is comfortable with S3 at this point. And so starting early means that you're kind of designing for running in a customer environment from first principles, which has the follow-on effect of making it so that you can kind of continually do it without as much pain. We also see sort of the later stage companies, which have maybe started with like a single tenant model or something like that. And what they're doing is essentially kind of saying, hey, we've already invested in a lot of different environments, or we have some automation, we can package it. And so we see it's almost like really early or much later. And the really early folks, like they just really care about like, hey, can I like package it and deploy into a customer environment? And they're going to learn where the hard parts come later, right? And that goes back to your point, Tim, around like, the underestimating thing. For the later stage companies, they actually understand this pain because they've had to run their software and evolve it. And, we've all done this sort of like database update, or like you're changing Postgres versions, or God forbid, you're going from like Postgres to MySQL or back or something like that, or you're adding a new data store, like how hard that is. And they're like, those are the problems that are really interesting that we do not want to have to solve for. We want infrastructure for. And where we see it's like, well, for those later stage companies, they already have like a lot of enterprise customers. Maybe they have some sort of like manual BYOC or manual self-hosted thing. But really like the pain comes from like the integration and the migrations and things like that. The early folks, and this is where the interesting part is, I think for early BYOC adopters, they might just kind of be conflating BYOC readiness with product market fit. And like that's something that we've seen that's kind of interesting, where like you'll see like a pre-product market fit company who's like struggling to understand the difference between like, hey, does like the fact that I can deploy my customer account helps me unlock this customer, but are they going to see value? And on the flip side, if they're like, maybe they do have a really valuable product, but like the customer has no way of knowing because they haven't been able to do a good pilot with like real data. And so it is kind of like a challenge both ways, right? And, generally like what I've seen kind of in the wild is like honestly, like the first 2 or 3 customers, like test both and be like, hey, like tell your customers, hey, we have a BYOC option. And honestly, like worst case scenario, like go to their office and sit with them and give them your Helm chart or something like that and like deploy it manually. And then once you actually are ready to go to production, then you're looking at things like, how do we migrate existing data? How do we do updates? How do we sort of do version changes? And like what happens like to the security aspects of that? And those are where I think like Nuon infrastructure, like where infrastructure like Nuon needs to exist. There needs to exist ways to like break glass and check for drift in customer accounts and push updates and have like approvals and like a lot of the sort of day 2 things that we help you with. Whereas just like the packaging and installing, like, to be honest, like you can hand your customer a repo with Terraform and like sit in an office with them and run some Terraform commands, right? And like, it's not really BYOC, but at the same time, like it'll help you get that first customer, and then you can kind of solve these problems later, which is kind of how we design the product as well, actually. Like Nuon is designed to let you just take your Terraform, your infrastructure as code, like all that stuff, like connect it to Nuon, whether it's Kubernetes or not, doesn't really matter. Like you have all these primitives, but then as you're like pushing updates, you're changing your app, like you add a database on day 2, right? Like how do you do that? How do you sort of like facilitate that upgrade? How do you run sort of like health checks inside of a customer account? How do you check for drift? Like your customer goes in and deletes a bucket or something. Like how do you know that happened? And then how do you give that customer an audit trail? And those are things that you're probably not going to need for the very first deployment for a test, but for like production to scale it, to have like more than 5 or 6 customers or a customer per engineer on your side, then you start to need those things. And ideally, like open source even helps make that sort of easier to adopt as you go, right? And I think one of the hopes of like open source in general is that you kind of get like a little bit of build and buy, where people feel empowered to like modify and change things and like have like an extension, which is something that we're kind of thinking about as like a natural way to like have like extensions to Nuon workflows. But then at the same time, like they're like, hey, I'm not going to write all this thing myself. Like I see this huge kind of repo, and yeah.
So we talked a lot about trust, community contributions, and being very closely tied to users as main reasons to open source. But probably the biggest other one we haven't talked about a ton is distribution. And that's like a huge reason why a lot of companies, their open source repo takes off. They see a lot of the demand, the users. Is that also how you're thinking about like the goals of this is, really kind of leading this movement of BYOC? This is going to make it a lot easier for people to get started, get comfortable with it. And like a year from now, this is just like really opened up a ton of new users to BYOC and Nuon.
That's my hope. The reason we exist is to make this shift the default way that software is deployed. Any infrastructure product, any software that's like used in production at work, we believe that should be BYOC. The sort of glass half full is like, in like our hope and dream here is that we can unite like all the different companies who are doing BYOC. Whether you're using a Nuon or not doesn't matter, right? Like I think people who are offering BYOC believe in this, and we want to sort of unify them together. And we hope that this can be the start of that. And like, there's the distribution aspect. I also mentioned about this like transactional nature of like closed source software, where it's like you're kind of buying or not. And like, yes, there's other ways to sort of collaborate, but like in the open source world, like the way of collaborating is like sharing a repo or like reading the README. And like, it's such a different relationship and investment. And we're hoping that by like lowering that barrier, where you can just explore and like see what we're doing without having to go sign up or, just like go read our docs, like can actually help kind of motivate like a way to like connect all of these BYOC companies today and then make more of them. And like the more of those BYOC companies there are, the more demand there is for things that integrate with them from the customers. And like, if you think about like BYOC, it's going to follow hopefully this sort of like SaaS graph trend, right? Like everybody says like SaaS is just like this giant graph. Infrastructure is this giant graph of like things connecting to each other. And the idea is like, if you get one node of the graph in the customer's environment, like everything that's connected to it also needs to move. And we want to lower the barrier to do that. And it's not just, hey, go sign up and use this and offer BYOC. It's play with the repo, start the repo, like open issues, ask questions. Like, you're not in a closed Slack channel or like a Discord. It's like, hey, this is an open thing that like you can go find. And I think a lot of our early efforts are going to be, how do we just honestly like disambiguate what BYOC is too? Like that's such a theme I think Tim and I have talked about so many times. It's like, even what we do, like, yes, like it's like we help you offer BYOC. What does that mean? What are the problems of BYOC? What are the hard parts? And I think a lot of like the distribution hope, like the hope we have there is like, just make that stuff all clearer. And like, when you Google BYOC, like you see like, hey, here's the good parts and the bad parts, the hard parts. And bring your own cloud is much different than on-prem or self-hosted. It's a lot closer to multi-tenant SaaS actually. And like, what are the challenges? And like, what is true BYOC? Like true BYOC is not handing your customer a Helm chart and saying like, good luck, right? Like BYOC is actually like you are running a SaaS in somebody else's environment. And we hope that we can just like make that clear and build a community that cares about it, right? And without that pressure of like, oh, like I have to try this thing or I have to use this thing. It's like, no, there's so many ways just to have that awareness, we hope.
Awesome. Well, We could have talked a lot more questions, but what's your advice for any founder you talk to that are earlier in their journey, or what you wish you even know back then?
That's a great question. The biggest thing I would say, and we haven't talked about it, we actually build Nuon with Nuon now. So we deploy Nuon into our customer accounts. And I would say that the one learning that I have is the power of that, of like using your own product every single day and feeling the pain every single day. And using it in earnest, not just like, hey, we're kind of testing it or something like that. Like the power of dog fooding is this like crazy feedback loop that you'll never know if you don't do it. And like I actually talked to like probably 10 or 15 founders about this, and like half of them were like, yeah, we just don't really have a great way to dog food yet or not. And I would say like that's probably been one of the bigger changes and actually also led to this open source decision. Because as we started to like build Nuon with Nuon, we open sourced our Nuon config and we use that as almost like a doc site sometimes. But we also were like starting to feel like, wow, like this feels like something that should be open source. Like, why am I not like liking a repo right now and like starting a repo and like, sharing with my friends or whatever. And, I think being your best user is one of the most powerful things. And yes, you're going to have like the amazing users who our users sometimes use the platform in ways that we would never expect, which is kind of hilarious and awesome. And like, those are the cool parts about building startups and building stuff. But then even I'm sometimes like amazed at like how even like engineers at Nuon use Nuon so differently and uniquely. And like it has led to these types of decisions. And like some of the core things like, part of this like idea of like open sourcing was like, hey, like there's a trust and a distribution and like all these benefits. But then there was also like, wow, this thing feels like it should be extendable. And like, I want to extend this thing in ways that like, I shouldn't have to go to like our Nuon, mono repo and do there. Like that should just be like, I want to have like a GitHub repo with like a Nuon extension, like all those sort of things that kind of come out of that. And I think that when you figure out that dog fooding loop, it helps make really tough decisions easier, right? Like I think the classic or one of the main answers I've seen to this kind of question before is like, make the hard decision earlier or whatever it is. But actually like you have so much more data when you're using your product and if it makes you and your team feel right. And dog fooding also leads to all these other sort of things that come out of it. And when I say dog fooding, I mean like not having like a test app or a sample app. It's like build your thing with your thing, right? And use it like as hard or harder than any other user that you have. And that's one of the things that I think leads to a lot. So,
well, we're so excited to be your partner on this release. This is super exciting. And I know we're going to be looking back like a year from now and have kind of like this huge movement that Nuon has accelerated even further on BYOC. So thank you so much for doing this with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for also letting us sort of like share this with the world here. And it'll be kind of cool to see in a year how much from this podcast was true versus not. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of awesome learnings and things we didn't expect and some really pleasant surprises hopefully as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jon.
Thank you.